Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are taking a look at Far Cry 6, but in the typical Hardware Unboxed fashion, so lots and lots of benchmarks. And just to be clear, this isn't a review of Far Cry 6, though I have spent several hours playing the game, and I can confirm it plays like a Far Cry game, but with more interesting gunplay, so that's probably what Far Cry fans want. That said, graphically, it does look a fair bit like the other recently released titles in the franchise, think New Dawn and Far Cry 5, but there are certainly some visual upgrades. Ubisoft's still using the Junior 2 game engine, which was first introduced way back in 2012 with Far Cry 3, though this engine is meant to be in constant development, and visually the game has certainly evolved significantly over the past 9 years. Now, because Far Cry 6 is an AMD-sponsored title, it does support FSR with 4 presets to choose from, but for today's video, I'm going to ignore FSR for a few reasons, with the primary reason simply being time. FSR testing requires a lot of time, really its own dedicated video, including not just benchmark data, but also a very in-depth and detailed analysis of image quality, something I simply can't do while also benchmarking over 30 current and previous generation AMD and NVIDIA GPUs at 3 resolutions using 2 quality presets along with a look at ray tracing performance. Speaking of which, yes, this game does support ray tracing with the ability to enable DXR reflections and DXR shadows. Now, because DXR shadows are kind of pointless in my opinion and not worth the performance hit, I haven't tested with them enabled, but I have taken a look at DRX reflections, so we'll look at that shortly using supported hardware. I should also mention that Far Cry 6 does include a built-in benchmark, and it does appear to accurately represent in-game performance, but I've decided instead to test in-game as we generally prefer to do this anyway. That said, I will refer to the built-in benchmark for a few direct visual quality comparisons, as it is very useful for that sort of thing. It's also worth noting that I'll be testing exclusively with the HD texture pack enabled, which according to the quality settings menu takes the VRAM requirements with the ultra quality preset enabled from 5.2GB up to 6.2GB, and of course we will take a look at VRAM requirements towards the end of the video. Then, as usual, I'll be using our Ryzen 9 5950X GPU test system, which features 32GB of dual-rank, dual-channel DDR4 3200CL14 memory. For the GeForce GPUs, I'm using Game Ready Driver 472.12, and for the Radeon GPUs, Early Access Driver Adrenalin 2110.1. Now, it's not clear if NVIDIA will improve driver performance beyond what we're showing here, but please be aware that AMD did supply an early access driver, while NVIDIA hasn't, but the current GeForce driver does note updated support for Far Cry 6. Okay, so we'll start by taking a look at performance using the ultra quality preset, and then we'll move into some testing using the medium quality preset. So let's get to it. Starting with the 1080p Ultra results, we'll have to scroll through the graph as I couldn't squeeze all 32 data points in while still making the graph easy to read. That said, please note that these graphs will be made available to Floatplane and Patreon members as images. So, starting from the top, we unsurprisingly find the RTX 3090, which is either CPU or Game Engine limited here, peaking at just 126 FPS. So basically the same performance you'll receive from the 3080 Ti, as well as the 6900 XT and standard RTX 3080. In fact, even the 6800 XT and 6800 are right there, so this isn't a game where you can easily drive really high frame rates for super fast panels. That said, 100 plus FPS is probably more than enough for a Far Cry style game, at least for most players. Now, although this is an AMD sponsored title, and AMD did provide an early access driver, I'd say overall performance looks quite neutral, at least here at 1080p, as the RX 6700 and RTX 3070 are very evenly matched. NVIDIA's Turing-based GPUs are also roughly where you'd expect them to be, with the RTX 2080 Ti matching the 3060 Ti. That said, the 5700 XT performed exceptionally well, beating the RTX 2080, and that meant it was 16% faster than the 2070 Super. That's uncharacteristically fast for the old RDNA GPU, but we have seen it do very well in other recently sponsored AMD titles. Interestingly, the 6600 XT, which typically mimics the 5700 XT, was quite a bit slower, rendering just 90 FPS on average, and that was only enough to match the vanilla 5700. That said, it was at least able to match or just nudge ahead of the RTX 3060, which seems to be its primary competitor at the moment based on current pricing. Then we have the 5600 XT, which, like the other RDNA models, is performing really well in Far Cry 6, basically matching the RTX 3060 and 2060 Super, which isn't something you'll often see. Even Vega is doing exceptionally well here, with Vega 56 matching the GTX 1080 Ti, and that led to a bit of a what the moment when I saw those results. In fact, it looks like Pascal in general sucks quite badly in Far Cry 6, at least with the current driver, as the 8GB 5500 XT was able to roughly match the GTX 1080, though it's worth noting the 4GB 5500 XT was a lot less impressive, presumably due to running out of VRAM. Moving up to 1440p provides a few unexpected results, though the margins are still incredibly small. But here the 1600 XT is able to overtake the RTX 3090, and normally expect the margin to widen in Ampere's favour as the resolution increases. We also see that the 6800 XT nudged ahead of both the 3080 Ti and 3080, though we're only talking about a very small margin here. Then we see that the Radeon RX 6800 also matched the 3070 Ti, while the RX 6700 was able to match the previous generation flagship GeForce part, the RTX 2080 Ti. Again, the 5700 XT was seen punching well above its weight, edging out the RTX 2080, which meant it was 13% faster than the 2070 Super. Then we see the RX 5700 matching the RTX 3060. Again though, we're seeing that the more limited bandwidth of the 6600 XT really does appear to be hurting it here, as the new mid-range Radeon GPU was good for just 64 FPS on average at 1440p, and that saw it only match the RTX 3060 along with the RTX 2070 and 2060 Super. Then we have the 5600 XT, which relative to the Turing-based competition, it's right where you'd expect it to be, trailing the 2060 Super by a 10% margin. However, it's Pascal that really struggles in this title. Typically, you'd expect to find the GTX 1080 shadowing the 2060 Super by less than a 10% margin, but here it was 25% slower, and that meant Vega 56 was again faster than the GTX 1080. The 5500 XT 8GB was also able to match the GTX 1070, though the RX 580 is about where you'd expect it to be, so on par with the GTX 1060. Then we see that any GPU with a 4GB VRAM buffer can't handle these quality settings at 1440p. Now, for the 4K Ultra data, where we find gamers who are seeking the most visually impressive Far Cry 6 experience, short of enabling ray tracing, will require some pretty serious rendering hardware. The RTX 3090 was back on top here with 79 FPS on average, which for an open world game of this quality is exceptionally good. Tim and I agree that Far Cry 6 looks better than Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and here the RTX 3090 is 34% faster when compared to our test data for Valhalla. It's also a similar margin when comparing the results from Watch Dogs Legion. The Radeon RX 6900 XT is also seen performing really well here, basically matching the RTX 3090, and that enabled an excellent 4K gaming experience. That being the case, the 6800 XT also performed very well and was positioned between the 3080 Ti and 3080. Then below that, we're heading down towards 60 FPS with the likes of the RX 6800 and 3070 Ti, while parts like the 3060 Ti and RX 6700 are down around 50 FPS, which is still okay and certainly playable, but I think with those parts and anything slower, I'd drop down to 1440p and take the hit on visual quality for those higher frame rates. Here's a quick look at a visual side-by-side of the ultra versus medium quality presets. Now, because I'm using HD textures for both tests, they do look very similar, and this is likely because texture quality is one of the most important features of image quality. The difference in terrain quality is minuscule, as is the water quality. I think the big one here really is shadow quality, though the difference isn't always noticeable. Volumetric fog does look much better on Ultra, but we're really not seeing any examples of that here. I think it's fair to say that most of you will be just as happy using the medium quality preset, but let's move on to see how much extra performance it offers. Now for the medium quality preset results, and here we are seeing an increase in performance at 1080p even with the flagship GPUs. That said, lower quality settings can reduce CPU load and even alleviate game engine bottlenecks, so it's still not entirely clear which limitation has been mitigated in order to increase the bottleneck limit by roughly 15%. But we know that we're still not GPU limited here with the 6900 XT and 6800 XT delivering the same level of performance. Then as we scroll down this graph, we're seeing strong performance from all the usual suspects. And again, just as we saw with the ultra quality preset, the RX 6700 and 3070 delivered identical performance. The 5700 XT is also extremely strong here, matching the RTX 3060 Ti, which is nuts really. And the 137 FPS average again meant that it edged out the RTX 2080, making it 6% faster than the RTX 2070 Super. Yet despite that, the 6600 XT was only able to match the standard 5700, though that did make it a few frames faster than the RTX 3060. Then we have the 5600 XT, which roughly matched the RTX 2070, and that made it a little faster than the RTX 2060. And again, Vega 56 can be seen beating the GTX 1080 Ti, making it a whopping 23% faster than the standard GTX 1080. The RX 580 also does better with the medium quality preset, pulling ahead of the GTX 1060 by an 11% margin to match the GTX 1070. Again though, it was a struggle for some of the 4GB models, and although the GTX 1650 Super did well, the 5500 XT can once again be found at the very bottom of our graph. The 1440p median results see the vast majority of GPUs tested still able to render over 60 FPS on average. But let's start towards the top, and again we find the 1600 XT matching the RTX 3090, along with the 6800 XT and 3080 Ti. The RTX 3080 and RX 6800 were similar, and both just managed to average over 130 FPS. Then from 125 FPS down to 117 FPS, we have a range of NVIDIA GPUs, with the RX 6700 coming in at 115 FPS. So above it was the 3060 Ti, 2080 Ti, 3070 and 3070 Ti. Again, the 5700 XT was able to match the RTX 2080, though this time that meant it was just a few frames faster than the 2070 Super, but still an incredible result for the first generation RDNA part. Less impressive though was the 6600 XT, as it was only able to match the vanilla 5700, and that made it a few frames slower than the standard RTX 3060, which really is a very disappointing result for an AMD sponsored title, especially given that parts such as the 5600 XT did so well, nudging ahead of the RTX 2060 to come in just behind the 2060 Super. Also, Vega 56 was again very impressive, trailing the GTX 1080 Ti by just a 7% margin. It is worth mentioning though that the mid-range to low-end GPUs saw a 30 to 40% performance improvement with the medium quality preset, opposed to Ultra, and I've got to say that is a massive increase for what is often only a very small difference in visual quality. Then with the standard GTX 1080, we're looking at just 62 FPS on average, while the 8GB 5500 XT puts us just below 60 FPS on average. And parts such as the GTX 1070, 1650 Super and RX 580 did enable playable performance, but depending on the frame rates you're chasing, you might want to lower the quality settings even further. Then for those of you that wish to game at 4K and are happy to do so with dialed down quality settings, I've got good news for you. Far Cry 6 is very playable with most modern graphics cards. NVIDIA does pull ahead here at the high end, with the RTX 3090 and 3080 Ti edging out the 1600 XT, though the RTX 3080 and 6800 XT were very comparable, as were the RX 6800 and RTX 3070 Ti. Then, with the RX 6700 and RTX 2080, we're dipping down towards 60 FPS, while there were several options capable of 50 FPS, such as the RTX 3060, the GTX 1080 Ti, RTX 2070, and 2060 Super. Below that, you can start to really notice the frame rate lag, and as such, you'd probably want to dial the resolution back down to 1440p or even lower. Okay, so here's a very quick look at the visual quality difference, or lack thereof, between Ultra with and without DXR reflections enabled. I have watched this footage over quite a few times and I couldn't really spot the difference, so I decided to turn to a trained eye in Tim, who informed me that ray tracing is working and there is a difference. Here's the example he gave me, but to best illustrate it, I've significantly reduced the playback speed and zoomed in by 400%. There you go, see the car has a bigger and more realistic shadow, which admittedly does look better reflected in the puddle of water, but yeah, that's pretty much it. I should note that when playing the game, the visual differences really aren't that much more noticeable than the built-in benchmark, and as such the performance hit is much the same. So no surprises there, Radeon GPUs aren't very good at real-time ray tracing yet, but since they have advertised to support it, and AMD wants to push the marketing angle forward, best to include ray tracing, but just do very little of it to avoid any serious performance penalties. So with DXR reflections enabled, we're only looking at a 10 to 15% reduction in performance which explains why the effects are so hard to spot. Games with more prominent ray tracing effects will see a part like the 1600 XT drop at least 40% of its original performance. So again, given how small the performance hit here is, it's unsurprising that I really struggle to tell when the feature was enabled. Frankly, I'd just run with ray tracing disabled, but let's take a look at the 1440p results. At 1440p, we're looking at a 20% performance hit for the 1600 XT with DXR reflections enabled, and a 13% hit for the RTX 3090. Both are comparatively small to most other titles that support DXR effects, but even so, given the extremely minor upgrade to visuals, at least seen in my testing, I don't think I'd bother enabling it. Again, at 4K, we're looking at a 22% drop in performance for the 1600 XT, with just a 13% hit for the RTX 3090. The more rays you cast, the more that margin will be exacerbated, which is obviously why AMD has opted for extremely limited use of ray tracing for this title. Now here's a look at Far Cry 6 VRAM usage with the HD texture pack enabled, using the Radeon RX 6800 XT. Please note these figures were reported after 10 minutes of gameplay, and for each quality setting or resolution change, the game was completely closed and the process was repeated for accurate data. You may have noticed that 4 and 6GB cards were removed from the 4K results, and that's because they basically didn't work, with most spitting out 2 to 3 frames per second. And this is because the game, even with the medium quality preset, will require more than 6GB of VRAM, and exceeding that buffer completely breaks performance. That said, some configurations still worked. The RTX 2060, for example, appeared fine with ray tracing enabled, despite the game using over 8GB of VRAM at 1080p and 1440p, though it was completely broken at 4K. For 1440p gaming, you'll ideally want a GPU with 6GB of VRAM as the minimum when using the ultra and medium quality settings, and really 4GB is sketchy even at 1080p using medium. So that's how Far Cry 6 runs on current and previous generation GPUs, and I'd say given the visual quality on display here, the results are quite good. The Far Cry series has never been well optimized for driving high frame rates, but I also don't think it needs to be. As it is a predominantly single player open world game, most gamers will be happy with 60 FPS, while the pickier gamers, such as myself, will be content with 90 FPS. That means for those of you who just want to max out the quality settings without tinkering to get the best balance of performance and visuals, you can achieve around 90 FPS with an RTX 3060 Ti or RX 6700 at 1440p, so not too bad. Then more modest previous generation GPUs such as the 5700 XT will be good for around 80 FPS, though you will require something a lot more expensive from Nvidia to achieve the same level of performance, such as the RTX 2080. Then dialing the quality preset back to medium can improve frame rates quite substantially while only slightly downgrading the visuals, and for those of you using mid-range to low-end hardware, I feel this is a really great option. The 5700 XT, RTX 2080, 2070 Super and RTX 3060 are real good for over 90 FPS at 1440p, while 60 FPS was achievable with rather modest hardware, think 1660 Ti or 5600 XT. As an AMD-sponsored title, you'd expect Radeon GPUs to perform really well, and they did, though there were some surprising results, some good and some not so good. The high-end RDNA 2 parts, such as the 1600 XT, the 6800 XT, the 6800 and 6700, all performed really well relative to their GeForce competitors. However, the 6600 XT was disappointing, as it could only match the RX 5700, which is surprising given that it's typically on par with the 5700 XT, though we have found that's not always the case, and Far Cry 6 is another example of that. But it might not be a case of the 6600 XT performing worse than expected. After all, it did roughly match the RTX 3060 in most of our testing. Instead, it could be that RDNA-based GPUs, namely the 5600 XT, 5700 and 5700 XT, performed really well. One possible reason being memory bandwidth. All three models enjoy a lot more of it when compared to the 6600 XT, which is more comparable to the 5500 XT. Of course, the 6600 XT does have some infinity cache, though it is hard to say just how useful that smaller 32MB buffer really is. Anyway, I think it's fair to say that the 5700 XT was very impressive here, while the 6600 XT was a bit underwhelming. And the surprises didn't actually stop there. Vega 56 was amazing, pumping out 70 FPS on average at 1440p using the medium quality preset, and that made it just 7% slower than the GTX 1080 Ti and faster than the rest of the Pascal GeForce lineup. So it'll be very interesting to see if future NVIDIA driver releases improve Pascal performance. Finally, as for Far Cry 6's ray tracing, there's not much to talk about here in my opinion. We know this isn't a strength of RDNA 2, and as AMD's first foray into ray tracing, that wasn't terribly unexpected. Still, given that ray tracing became a key buzzword with the release of Nvidia's Turing architecture, AMD really did need to counter it with something, no matter how weak the performance. So the game does support ray tracing, but whether or not it's worth the performance hit, albeit a very small performance hit, well, that'll be up to you. Personally, I couldn't even tell when it was enabled, but I didn't go super in depth with my exploration, so maybe there's something I missed there. Anyway, that is going to do it for this look at Far Cry 6 GPU performance. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a like. It was a tremendous amount of work that spanned many, many days of nothing but benchmarking day and night. Also, we have Floatplane and Patreon for those of you who would like to join the Hardware Unboxed community. Links for those are in the video description. You get access to exclusive Discord server, the Hardware Unboxed exclusive Discord server. Tim and myself, we do a monthly live stream for Hardware Unboxed community members, Q&As, behind the scenes content, a lot of cool stuff there. I am building a new studio, so I've been doing a bit of behind the scenes content there, which is a Patreon Floatplane exclusive. So if you're interested in that, check it out. There's some other cool stuff there as well. Anyway, if you're not interested, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.